Hey, y'all, it's Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Good to have you with us. It's going to be a great show today. Mike Johnson a little bit later on. We're going to talk a little Jake Fromm here over the course of our time together as well. And what I thought was a really fun Twitter exchange yesterday involving Andrew Thomas, I think it leads us into a pretty interesting discussion on Georgia's brand new left tackle as well. That's all coming up. As I said, I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm really glad you're here. DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, begins right now.
From DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I saw something on Twitter yesterday that I really loved for a variety of reasons. I'm going to explain it to you. I think you're going to like it here as well. You know, one of the things we make a big deal about here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, is some of these preseason lists, the offseason chatter, the conversation. I've made no bones about the fact, and I've never hidden from the fact that I just love this stuff. As much as I want to sort of, at times push the fast forward button and get to the start of the season, there is also a part of me that really likes the kind of hot take season of here's who I think is going to be good, both for Georgia and around the SEC. Here's how I think the pecking order of the SEC is going to kind of stack up here. I just like opinions, right? I love the thing about college football maybe the most is that it's the sport that sometimes seems to generate the most passionate opinions, and that's always been a really fun thing for me to be a part of that conversation. It's kind of cool to see Georgia kind of getting in on the mix here on this a bit as well. I've told you before, I like preseason magazines. A lot of, if you want to go back to sort of the old school days, in some cases pre-internet or in sort of the nascent stages of the internet, it was the preseason magazines that really generated the most off-season chatter. Well, they still are paid attention to by some, including apparently the official Twitter account from the Georgia Bulldogs. Here's what Georgia tweeted recently, kind of bragging about some of the Georgia players who made the Athlon Sports preseason All-American list. And if you're watching, you'll see this on your screen. If you're listening, I will describe this to you. But there's an entire collection of names on here from Athlon Sports. One of those names is the Georgia left tackle, the brand new left tackle, Andrew Thomas. And, obviously that's kind of a cool thing. And, what we've kind of said before about this kind of stuff is that, we like this. We like to see the preseason chatter, the sort of predictions of who's going to be good. And if you're watching right now, you can see the 5 guys that got consideration from Athlon Sports for preseason All-American. Rodrigo Blankenship as a third-team kicker. DeAndre Baker as a second-team cornerback. Maybe too low for him. We'll see. McCole Hardman as a second-team kick returner. DeAndre Swift as a second-team all-purpose back. And Andrew Thomas as a third-team All-American offensive lineman. So 5 Georgia players getting some preseason love from Athlon Sports as All-Americans. Georgia makes kind of a nice, cool graphic of all those guys together, and that's just sort of a fun thing for college football. Well, apparently it is also sort of a fun thing for one of Andrew Thomas's friends here as well, because the way that friends can sometimes do on social media with each other, sort of poking each other and picking at each other, one of Andrew Thomas's friends sort of took a little bit of a jab at him. I think it's absolutely a friendly jab. As I said, this is kind of just what guys do on social media. He sort of saw Andrew Thomas, who had retweeted the tweet from Georgia. He kind of came back with one of those deals of Andrew Thomas, only third string. Why are you even playing? In fact, if you're watching, we'll show this to you right now. Mark Somerville is his name. Now, there is a Mark Somerville that at one point in time was a two-sport athlete at Pace Academy, the same school that Andrew Thomas went to. I'm assuming this is one of the same Mark Somerville, who tweets back at Andrew Thomas, third team, might as well not even play, bro, and has some laughing emojis, things like that. Essentially having some fun with the fact that Andrew Thomas was on the third team All-American list instead of the second or the first team. I actually feel sorry for Somerville on this, because I think some Georgia fans, when they saw his tweet to Andrew Thomas, they thought he was being serious. They thought he was actually picking at Andrew Thomas, and obviously Georgia fans don't take too kindly to that. They love their left tackle after all, but this was just a joke. It was just all in fun. But Andrew Thomas's response was classic, and I think it's one that a lot of Georgia fans are going to like here, and it really sets us up for where we want to go today in terms of talking about Andrew Thomas. After Mark Somerville said you might as well not even play if you're only third-team All-American, Andrew Thomas comes back and says, hey, man, I just won a national championship. Everything else will take care of itself. That's the tweet in response to that, and boy, I'm telling you, I think a lot of Georgia fans are going to like that, even if he didn't, have a whole lot of meaning behind it, even if this is just Andrew Thomas's way of kind of dusting off the jab from one of his friends. The fact that Andrew Thomas is sort of putting national championships ahead of individual concerns like being an All-American, I think speaks to the kind of player and person, man, if you will, that Andrew Thomas is growing into over the course of his time here at the University of Georgia. He really sounds like a leader when he says things like that. And I think sounding like a leader and growing into that role for Andrew Thomas is something that Georgia fans are going to have to get used to. They saw it a bit as a freshman when Thomas was a starter at right tackle. I think you're going to see it even more here in 2018 as Thomas makes the transition to the most important role of all for the offensive line at left tackle. I think this growing into this role for Thomas is really going to happen in two different venues here. On the one hand, it's going to be a leader by example. He's already doing that. The reviews for the way that he performed during left tackle this spring were raving reviews for the most part, including even Kirby Smart, who pretty early on during spring practice gave Thomas the best compliment of all. Sometimes no news being the best news for an offensive lineman. That's certainly the viewpoint that Kirby Smart expresses when he brags on Andrew Thomas. Here is Kirby on Thomas from earlier in the spring.
I probably hadn't paid close attention to it as much as I should. I do know this: if you don't notice him, it's probably a good thing. It's not like there's popping up sacks and things. I mean, it's very quiet. It's like, okay, there's not a lot of issues over there. We hadn't got a lot of pass rush off that side. He's made the transition well.
Yeah, made the transition well, and that's sort of an example of being a leader by example, right? Doing your job on the football field, I think, gives you credibility with your teammates. I think football is a sport where being a leader requires you to do well on the field. You know, you have the aging veteran in Major League Baseball who can sometimes be the clubhouse leader. You have the veteran on an NBA roster who can kind of sometimes do the same kind of thing. But in football, leaders are good players. And in football, because you're putting your life on the line out there every single day, credibility is earned by physicality. And Andrew Thomas is certainly earning that leadership by example credentials, even going back to the spring here. But there's more for Andrew Thomas to do, and Kirby Smart's been very clear about that. Kirby Smart has talked about the need for Thomas to do more of the kind of things that maybe he did on Twitter yesterday, putting national championships ahead of individual accolades, becoming a true vocal leader. That is certainly something that Kirby Smart views as kind of the next frontier for Andrew Thomas, and back during the spring, Kirby Smart said as much.
The challenge for Andrew is, can he become a vocal leader, not just a leader by example? He's got to learn to push other guys and challenge other guys along with Lamont, and I think he can be that kind of impact leader.
The Lamont that he mentions there is Georgia center Lamont Gilliard, who himself is also probably a pretty good leader for UGA. Now, my guess is Andrew Thomas, given his background coming from Pace Academy and the training that he got there and what he showed as a freshman, and sort of drawing from my own personal interview with him from Marlowe's Tavern about a year or so ago, I guess it's been more than a year or so now, I'm very confident Andrew Thomas will grow into the role of being a very good leader, and I'm confident he's going to grow into the role of being a very good offensive lineman as well, which sort of brings me to the next point that I wanted to make on Andrew Thomas. I don't think the national media knows yet just how good Andrew Thomas is eventually going to be. Maybe even to say it a slightly different way, I don't think the national media knows how good Andrew Thomas is going to be starting this year. And the rise of Thomas as a player could also coincide with the rise of Jake Fromm as a quarterback and the rise of Georgia as a program. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. USA Today recently ranked its top 10 quarterbacks for college football for 2018. Once again, one of these sort of off-season predictions, much the same way the Athlon All-American list was that we referenced a couple of minutes ago. Jake Fromm does show up on this list only at number 7, behind a couple of quarterbacks from the SEC, which we'll talk more about, I guess, a bit later on in the program. Nothing wrong with only being the 7th best quarterback in the country. In a way, that's kind of a compliment. But in specifically looking at what Paul Meyerberg, the writer, writes here, you get a sense that maybe there's a misunderstanding of exactly what Georgia's going to be about here this season. Let me show you, if you're watching, the quote from Paul Meyerberg, and if you're listening on the radio or if you're listening to the podcast, I'll read it to you. When Paul Meyerberg writes about Jake Fromm here in 2018, he says, "The best is still yet to come for Fromm, though it's hard to overestimate the importance of him spending an entire offseason as the Bulldogs' unquestioned starter." Meyerberg goes on to say, "He'll be better in 2018, more confident, more under control, savvier in the face of SEC defenses." But now listen to the transition here for Paul Meyerberg. He starts to mention some of the challenges that Fromm's going to deal with. Then again, he'll have more on his plate as Georgia breaks in a new backfield and a new starter at left tackle. That's, of course, the aforementioned Andrew Thomas. Meyerberg finishes up by saying Fromm seems up to the challenge of becoming the face of the Bulldogs offense. Now, Jake Fromm up to that challenge, that may very well be true. But as far as part of that challenge being breaking in a brand new left tackle, I don't necessarily think that's the case here. I think that Andrew Thomas is far closer to being one of Georgia's major strengths than he is from being one of Georgia's minor weaknesses, which seems to be the suggestion made there by Paul Meyerberg at USA Today. In fact, that leadership role that Kirby Smart wants to see Andrew Thomas take on, I think there's some evidence to suggest that he's already taking that on, even last year when he was still Georgia's freshman right tackle. Go back to right before the national championship game, when Andrew Thomas was talking about the hallmark that he wanted the Georgia offensive line to be, already growing into that role in 2017. The thing that Andrew Thomas believes in is physicality. And the physicality that Andrew Thomas brings to the Georgia offensive line is something that I think that Jake Fromm is going to use here in 2018. In fact, here is Andrew Thomas talking about that physicality.
Well, we just tried to change the culture, and basically we just play physical every day. And it starts in practice. We practice hard every day. It starts with our O-line coach, Coach Pittman, and he just pushes us to be the best we can be.
Look, the bottom line for me on this, and you hear Andrew Thomas, a lot to like from him on that. The presence of Andrew Thomas on this Georgia team here in 2018 is not some sort of challenge for Fromm to overcome. I really think it's an ally for Jake Fromm, because I do think that Jake Fromm and Andrew Thomas have a mutual goal. As Andrew Thomas stated on Twitter, they want to win a national championship. With Fromm at quarterback, and a seasoned sophomore, and Andrew Thomas at left tackle, eventually over the next couple of years, that goal might actually be accomplished. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Marco's Pizza, and we are glad you were with us, no matter how you get to us today. Video-wise, a lot of ways to check us out. DawgNation Facebook page, DawgNation YouTube page. We're also available on the DawgNation Twitter feed. We're live there at 10 a.m. each and every day. We're on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Rep, and we're available in podcast form. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, the world-famous DawgNation.com, SoundCloud. We're just really glad you have found DawgNation Daily. Really looking forward to being with you as a part of the program today. We'll get Mike Johnson here coming up in just a moment. I'll also remind you the DawgNation Daily is presented to you today by Marco's Pizza. They invite you to say hello primo, and a great way to do that. A great offer right now. You can get 2 medium, 2-topping pizzas for just $6.99 each. I'm talking about authentic Italian pizza with that Gianmarco family recipe in the sauce, the 3 melted cheeses right there on top of the authentic Italian crust. My family loves Marco's Pizza, especially this time of year. It seems like we're always looking to get something quick and convenient so we can enjoy more time outside, and well, Marco's Pizza gives us a chance to do that. So I invite you to also say hello to Primo. Go to marcos.com for more on that. All right. One of the other things I want to talk about here on our program today before we get ready to bring on Mike Johnson to the show, I mentioned Jake Fromm a moment ago, and I kind of want to dive more in to the Jake Fromm situation and kind of what he looks to be for Georgia in 2018. Now, there is a cluster of pretty well-regarded quarterbacks in the SEC for this upcoming season. It's really kind of a departure from sort of typical norms for this conference, where seemingly sometimes this is thought to be a league that underwhelms the quarterback position. And in 2018, that may not be the example. Now, different people have sort of different opinions about which of these guys is going to be the best, and that's all fair and good. I mean, who could fault anybody for, ranking one of these guys above the other? Obviously, here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, probably no surprise to find out we're pretty big fans of Jake Fromm. We think he's good. We think he's better, actually, even than maybe an outlet like Sports Illustrated thinks, who recently ranked him as just the number 65 player in the country here for 2018. Now, to SI's credit, they kind of did a pretty interesting piece of content that I think also validates the opinion of some Georgia fans that maybe at 65, Jake Fromm was too low. What I mean by this is they sort of, after they ranked their top 100 players, and you can go to SI.com and find the full top 100, kind of a playoff what the NFL Network's been doing for a long time. They then followed up with another piece of content of, if we got it wrong, who do we get it wrong on? And at least one of the writers thinks there's a chance that Fromm may be rated too low. Let me show you what Chris Johnson wrote at SI about this. He says about Fromm maybe being too low at 65, that Fromm vastly exceeded expectations as a true freshman, ranking 3rd among returning quarterbacks in ESPN's total QBR, and behind only Missouri's Drew Lock among SEC quarterbacks in efficiency and yards per attempt. And yards per attempt, as y'all know, is always the most important stat for me. It's reasonable, Chris Johnson says, to project Fromm to make a not insignificant leap as a passer during his second season under center. Once again, that's Chris Johnson from Sports Illustrated talking about the chances that maybe SI underrated Jake Fromm in its top 100 list that came out not too long ago, in which Fromm rated at 65. And I think there's an important point made by Chris Johnson there. You see what Fromm was as a freshman, and you have to at least do some attempt at extrapolating how much improvement you might see in his second season as a sophomore, especially given the fact that Fromm got so much experience a year ago. And when Jake Fromm spoke with the media back during the spring, during Georgia spring practice, he also kind of acknowledged the same point, that he does feel more comfortable, not just on the football field, but around campus. I mean, he is a second-year college student now, and all of this is just coming a little easier to Fromm. Here he is to explain.
Definitely now I got a whole lot better of understanding of everything. Kind of have an idea of what's going on and, how to get to classes too on time. So that's definitely good for me. Football's been going pretty well. Just kind of get a better feel of things and kind of know how things run around here.
I joked yesterday on SEC Country Live, but a word that somebody had used in our DawgNation daily comment section, the word transcendent showed up on yesterday's show in terms of, quarterbacks that become better than just good quarterbacks. They actually become sort of all-time greats that we remember forever. I do think there's a really good chance that one of these quarterbacks in the SEC over the next couple of years, whether it be Stidham in what could be his final year, Tua Tagovailoa over the next few years, or maybe even Jake Fromm, one of these guys is going to become transcendent, and year 2 is usually a pretty good clue of when that happens. We may see that light come on for Jake Fromm here this season, and it's obviously true that leaning on some of his assets in the Georgia offense, like a big offensive line led by Andrew Thomas or some pretty dazzling running backs, all of that's going to go a long way towards helping Fromm be the best quarterback that he can be. It is great to have you with us here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. We got a lot of fun coming up on the program. One of the things I love about Wednesdays is a chance to check in with our buddy Mike Johnson from SEC Country Live. In fact, let's do that right now. And every Monday through Thursday afternoon, 3 p.m. Eastern Time on the SEC Country Facebook channels, you can check out SEC Country Live. Always love doing that show with Mike Johnson. Good enough to be with us here today on a DawgNation Daily presented by Marco's Pizza. Mike, thanks for your time. Appreciate you being here. How are you today?
I'm doing good, buddy. It's good to be back on with you.
It is good to have you on, and you know that one of the things I love when you get a chance to be with us here on DawgNation Daily presented by Marco's Pizza is when there's an issue involving the Georgia offensive line. I like leaning on your expertise because obviously you were a top-flight offensive lineman. I think most Georgia fans, Mike, as you know, really view this offensive line for UGA this season as potentially being one of the strengths. And one of the reasons they feel that way is most Georgia fans are confident about a guy that we just talked about, Andrew Thomas, making the transition from right tackle to left tackle. Now, Kirby Smart has said that, he likes the sort of, quiet way in which he went about his business during the spring. You didn't see giving up a lot of sacks during practice. That wasn't an issue really during G-Day for the most part. That he was sort of a quiet leader by example over there as a player. Also wants to see him now be more of a vocal leader in terms of, kind of what he does as the anchor of the UGA offensive line. I know you've had a chance to see some of Andrew Thomas yet, but have you seen enough of him yet to kind of determine whether you think that he does have a chance to really be that sort of all-American level player that some Georgia fans hope that he can be, and an outlet like Athlon Sports predicts that he might be?
Yeah, no, I've seen enough to know that, and I think that any offensive lineman or any offensive lineman coach that watches the way he plays, the way he's able to anchor, I think it's such a huge part of his game. I mean, that's really the biggest thing from crossing over the high school level to the college level. You can be quick, you can be long, you can have leverage, you can be a good run blocker. To be able to anchor, though, the way that he does in some of these bull rushes and some of these elite pass rushers from around the SEC, that really is going to make all the difference for him, whether that be on the right, whether that be on the left. And being able to kind of, check that box off the list and move on into a role where you can be more of a vocal leader and do some of those other things really starts and ends with his ability to play left tackle and to be a contributor for that football team. But from what I've seen on film, BA, I don't think there's any doubt. We're talking about a top-flight guy. I mean, he really does, in a lot of different ways, remind me of Jonah Williams over at Alabama on that transition from right to left last year. I mean, they mirror each other so much, just kind of under-the-radar type players. You don't hear much out of them, but moving into those leadership roles and being able to make that transition, he's got all the tools in the toolbox, that's for sure.
I think one of the things that Georgia fans like about this discussion is obviously Sam Pittman, the Georgia offensive line coach, is one of the most popular assistant coaches on this entire roster. I think he's one of the Georgia coaches that fans would be most afraid to lose, and sort of the rise and growth of Andrew Thomas is an example, I think, of why Dog fans like Pittman so much. I mean, you take this guy, now he was well-trained going back to his high school time at Pace Academy, but he becomes a solid starter in year 1 at right tackle, becomes potentially the anchor of the Georgia offensive line in year 2 at left tackle. I don't think you get there without some contribution from Sam Pittman, and obviously he probably does deserve some of the credit for what Thomas has been able to accomplish and the expectations for what he might accomplish this season.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. This points straight back to Sam Pittman, and for all the good things that Kirby Smart does as the head coach and all the strides that Georgia has made over the last couple of years, Kirby Smart is not an offensive line coach. He's not making these guys an all-SEC caliber, all-American caliber offensive lineman. That's Sam Pittman right up front doing that. And, being a part of that. And I think it's special, and I think it's special, honestly, not only for the players on the roster, but for recruits, to be able to look at those guys in front of them, to be able to look at those pipelines from around Atlanta and around the state of Georgia into Georgia and say, you know what, this isn't just me paying homage to, my state staying home. I can actually go there and develop into this all-SEC, all-American caliber offensive lineman, running back, whatever it may be. So Sam Pittman being in that category, and I can tell you, I can go on for years about, the relationship really between offensive linemen and their offensive line coaches, the trust that you have to develop in some of those roles. But I think this is a gleaming, shining example of what you want it to be between Andrew Thomas and Sam Pittman. And I don't see any reason why they would, falter off that course anytime soon. I think it's going to be an incredible kind of matchup and relationship to watch, and just how far each one of these guys can get the other one. And it's weird you kind of highlighted that like that, right? You're talking about Andrew Thomas, who's a player, and Sam Pittman, who's a coach, but I really think both of these guys and their popularity really go hand in hand along with each other, and as far as one of them goes, the other one will go right along with them.
So you and I had a pretty interesting conversation, at least I thought it was interesting, on SEC Country Live yesterday about where Jake Fromm kind of compares to other SEC quarterbacks. And I think, Mike, the point that I've been trying to make over the course of this offseason, while I'll acknowledge there's no obvious reason to rank him ahead of quarterbacks like Jarrett Stidham, who I think is really good, some of the other names you might mention, Drew Lock, who may be a first-round pick, there's also no obvious reason to rank Fromm below any of those guys. Certainly no obvious reason to rank him below a guy like Tua Tagovailoa, who's played a lot less football. But, it is also true that there are cases to be made from other quarterbacks. I guess the thing by way of question that I want to present to you is, and I brought this up to you yesterday, some of your skepticism, to the extent you have it, about Jake Fromm seems to be more about what you think the Georgia offense is still going to be in 2018, an offense that's mostly built around the power running game, which was the hallmark of the 2017 team, and really the last few years, Georgia's run the ball a lot more than it's thrown it. I have a sneaking suspicion that Georgia's actually going to throw the ball a good bit more this year. Not more throws than runs, but for a Georgia team that's essentially, ran it twice for every one passing attempt, I think it could be a little closer to a 50-50 balance, or at least a 60-40 type balance, but even that would be an upgrade over the ratio for before when it comes to the passing game. I guess the bottom line here, Mike, is if Georgia throws more, does that change your opinion of just how highly Fromm may eventually rank on top quarterbacks in college football?
I don't think there's any doubt about it. And it's like I told you yesterday. I don't have a vendetta out against Jake Fromm. I think Jake Fromm's an incredible quarterback. I do. I think the accuracy's there. I think his command of the offense is there. I think the intelligence level really off the charts. I mean, we're not even really talking about having comparisons. When you talk about the intelligence level within an offense that he displayed last year as a true freshman, really incredible. The reason I was having a tough time with the list is you look at a Jarrett Stidham there at 83 and look at the things he was asked to do last year within Auburn's offense. It's just a ton more. It really is a ton more. And I think the development of Jake Fromm can go a long way. I'm still not sure. And, I kind of battled back on you with that, yesterday talking about the passing game at Georgia. I'm not sure that we're going to see that. And you obviously are plugged into it. You know better than I do. But I look at what Kirby Smart is, I look at what his mentality always has been, and I look at the offensive line that he's built over there, and I look at the running backs that he's brought in. I don't think you throw it around unless you have to if you're Kirby Smart. And from the looks of things right now with that offensive line and running back team, tandem back there, I don't think he's going to have to. And I think that Jake Fromm, for a lot of different reasons, will still play within the offense. I think he'll still play Jake Fromm football. But I don't know that at the end of the year we're going to look back and say Jake Fromm was, a top 20, top 30, top 40 player. I have a hard time making that connection, just knowing what I think the output and where I think the stats are going to land within that Georgia offense.
So one of the things we talked about yesterday on DawgNation Daily was kind of the busy summer that Jake Fromm and Justin Fields, the other quarterbacks, seem to be having right now. Fromm has been at the Manning Passing Academy. He described some of the things that he's working on all summer long, and kind of, the Manning thing has always been one of those rites of passage for quarterbacks who kind of want to be in the rarefied air that Fromm's seeking out the chance to be. We've also seen some photos recently of Justin Fields working out with Deshaun Watson here, kind of an example of Fields trying to also put in some of that same work before his first year at college, the way that Fromm would have done a year ago. And I guess as a player, when you see these quarterbacks who are committed to these off-season workouts, and obviously an Instagram photo doesn't tell, the whole deal here, and a few, well-placed quotes from Jake Fromm, that doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story either, but the assumption we can reasonably make here, because there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, is that Fields and Fromm are both working out pretty hard here. When the quarterbacks are hitting it as hard as Fromm and Fields seem to be hitting it, what does that do for the rest of the team, the tone it sets for off-season workouts, offensive linemen in the weight room or receivers running routes? How does that change the calculus for the rest of the team?
I don't think it's hard to even quantify it, honestly, B.A. It's a huge deal. It's a bigger deal than probably anybody ever talks about it. I mean, let me just give you the scenario, right? You get on the sideline, you want your quarterback to be a leader. Maybe the offensive line isn't stepping up. Well, the quarterback's supposed to come up there and lead, right? So what does he do? He gets in the face of the offensive lineman. He's like, hey, we got to step up. Well, if that quarterback hasn't been working as hard as you, or hasn't been leading the team, or he hasn't been putting in the hours you've been, or hasn't been leading the 7-on-7s with the wide receiver, guess what? You don't care what that quarterback has to say. He doesn't have that aspect. He doesn't have that kind of platform to be able to talk to you like that. If they are going through that, though, and like they're obviously doing over there in Georgia right now with Jake Fromm and Justin Fields, if they're going through that scenario and working their butt off, and they are the guys leading the offense, and they are putting the hours in, and they are understanding the offense, and they are checking into different plays at the line of scrimmage and making sure you're in good scenarios, then you follow along with those guys. They become leaders. They develop the leadership, and it just makes it that much easier to look to a guy in a time of crisis and say, you know what? I trust this guy because I know he's put the work in, and I know he's going to put us in the best possible scenario. That's just a small piece of insight into what the psyche can be when your quarterback's going out there and outworking you.
I mentioned that photo of Justin Fields with Deshaun Watson. You played for the Falcons. I'm a Falcons fan. It kind of reminds you of, you've heard the offseason storyline about Julio Jones spending time with T.O., Terrell Owens. That's a personality maybe you don't want one of your star players kind of hanging around, catching some of what seems to have plagued T.O. over the course of years. However, anything that Justin Fields might be able to glean from Deshaun Watson feels like, from a Georgia fan's perspective, all good stuff. He seems to be a class act with the way that he's sort of gone about his business at Clemson and even now at the Houston Texans there in the NFL. Whatever DNA that Deshaun Watson might have, Justin Fields having some of that same kind of stuff, I think for a Georgia fan, they'd probably view that as a pretty good deal.
Well, I got to tell you, B.A., and not only that, I mean, I'll go one level deeper with you. I've told you this before. Deshaun Watson was our ball boy with the Falcons when I was up there. He was, up in the
I forgot
Georgia.
that, yeah.
Yeah, he's coming down and being a ball boy. And even back then, he was so quiet. He wasn't an outlandish guy. I mean, imagine that. You're a Division I quarterback. You've got all these scholarship offers, and you're spending your downtime kind of coming out and just being a ball boy or a water boy, out there for the Falcons. That's what he wanted to do, and just being around him for that short amount of time, I think a lot of people understood that he was going to be a great player. So, yeah, whatever Jake Fromm can follow along and kind of dig out of Deshaun Watson, boy, you're talking about a couple of good guys right there with their heads on straight that can play some college football.
I think we may talk about this at some point in time later on the week on DawgNation Daily, but Booger McFarland, who's now, I guess, a Monday Night Football analyst, goes on the Paul Feinbaum show this week and kind of talks about what he saw was a Georgia team that was very close to winning a national championship and maybe just didn't get it quite done there at the very end. We've obviously been over that ad nauseum now, but essentially saying this is a Georgia team in McFarland's mind that he seemingly has on par with Alabama, and maybe it's time for Kirby Smart to kind of show some of the swagger of the kind of coach that really is matching what Alabama is doing in a way that other SEC programs haven't quite been able to do. I don't know where this lands with you. For me, and I think most Georgia fans, that's the exact opposite of what they want to see Kirby Smart do. I think Georgia fans might kind of like the sort of steely determination from Smart, the fact that he is, for the most part, content to let his talking be done on the field here. I think most Georgia fans would say that's the thing that's actually made Kirby Smart great so far, or at least very good so far. I'm guessing you probably agree with that.
I 100% agree with you on that. And it's interesting, too, B.A., you and I talked yesterday. This conversation came up about Jimbo Fisher over at Texas A&M, and he's highlighting, the difference in the coach's office. And it just feels like Jimbo Fisher's getting a little bit out ahead of himself. You mentioned yesterday that you were, hey, listen, I'm going to sell a little bit of that stock I have in Jimbo Fisher just because it feels like his mouth is going somewhere that he hasn't quite, got his football team to go to yet. And obviously Kirby Smart has gotten his football team in the SEC, as far as that goes, to go miles farther than Jimbo Fisher has yet. But I'm with you. I like the attitude that Kirby has displayed. I like how it's a business-like mentality. I like how, and I told you this yesterday about Jimbo Fisher. I like hearing these coaches saying, hey, we're going to affect what we can affect. We're going to get better at what we can get better at. and we're going to concentrate on us. I don't need to hear Jimbo Fisher talking about things outside the program and have nothing to do with the players on his team right now. So I'm with you. I love the business-like mentality that Kirby has shown. I have no doubt in my mind. I've seen it. I know Kirby Smart has swagger. I know Kirby Smart loves to have a good time. I know he loves to chop it up. But, when it gets on the stage like that and you're in front of people that are expecting great things out of you, it's always the better approach, in my opinion, to take that business-like mentality and let people know that you're getting down to work.
Quick final comment from you. I mentioned that SI Top 100, and one of the things that I noticed about that was, Alabama had 5 players in the top 51. Georgia had just 1 in the top 50. And obviously things like that can change over the course of a season. I think it probably changed for Georgia in 2017. By the end of the year, they had more top-flight players than they would have thought to have been had at the beginning of the year. But that is an example, Mike, is it not, of the fact that if Georgia wants to keep pace, repeat as SEC champions, finding some of those new superstars emerging, that's got to happen, right, to match some of that top-end talent that Alabama has.
I think it definitely it can point to that. I mentioned you yesterday, and as a Bama guy, I try not to go that far into this, but to me, there's a little bit of a Bama bump in the rankings. I mean, for Dylan Moses right now to be ranked 20, 25 spots ahead of Devin White down at LSU is a little bit of a head-scratcher to me. But, yeah, I mean, I think when you look at those rankings, you look at the players that are up there, I have no doubt that Georgia's on par with Alabama, and that's the beauty of college football, is that it has to be played out on a football field, right? It doesn't matter what Raekwon Davis is ranked in the preseason. He still has to go up against this Georgia offensive line when it comes down to it, hopefully in the future for both teams. So, you can draw a few conclusions from it. I really do. Like I said, I hate to say it, but I think there's a little bit of a Bama bump in there with some guys. But it's going to be interesting to see and kind of project where these guys might, end up towards the end of the season. I think that some guys will jump on both teams. I think some guys will drop on both teams. And after this 2018 year, it's going to be interesting to kind of look back on it and say, hey, you know what? This is where these guys messed up.
All right, you've got Roll Tide Daily coming up this afternoon, and then we'll see you for SEC Country Live at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, Mike. It's always a blast to talk to you, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again soon.
All right, thanks, B.A. I'll see you this afternoon, buddy.
All right.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
All right, really good there from Mike Johnson, SEC Country Live. Mike's just a great analyst on the SEC, and I think he's certainly capable of calling it like he sees it. Some of y'all are like, oh, the Bama guy. But, I mean, after all this time, I think Mike Johnson's reputation speaks for itself. He comes on here and he gives us great analysis for UGA. He really speaks to what Andrew Thomas is going to be capable of doing this upcoming season. And you even hear him right there. When he thought Alabama guys were rated too high on that Sports Illustrated list, he certainly called it that way, too. So I think that's good stuff there from Mike Johnson. It's one of the reasons why I always like having him right here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. And really, what's been kind of fun to listen to for Mike this offseason is in this quarterback conversation around the SEC, the guy that Mike seems to tout the most frequently right now is actually Jarrett Stidham from Auburn. And some of y'all know that I'm also impressed with Stidham. Some of you say I brag on him too much. I certainly get where you come from on that. But I do think he's in that conversation for top quarterbacks in the SEC. And at least according to one outlet, he may be the best of them all. I mentioned before, earlier in the show, that Jake Fromm came in at number 7 on the list of top 10 quarterbacks in college football. According to USA Today, there were a couple of names from the SEC on this list. Stidham, the highest-rated guy, at 5 from USA Today. So by that argument alone, he is in the discussion to be, or at least according to USA Today, he is the top quarterback in the SEC. I guess that remains to be seen. I do think Stidham's going to have some challenges with his offensive line. I don't think the offensive line for Stidham at Auburn right now projects to be as good as the one for Fromm does at Georgia, but I do think that Stidham's a very good player. You've also got Drew Lock coming here at number 7 on this list. Kind of interesting that anybody would be ranked ahead of Lock, given the fact that most, I think, these mock drafts are going to have Lock as, very close to near the first quarterback taken. When it comes to something like that, Lock is really thought to be, if you'll pardon the bad pun, a lock for the first round of the NFL draft, and yet USA Today puts him below Jarrett Stidham. But what's also interesting here is the quarterbacks that don't make the top 10. Jake Bentley from South Carolina doesn't make that list. But how about this? Tua Tagovailoa not on this list of top 10 either. And I got to say, I'm going to commend USA Today. I believe it's Paul Meyerberg who's the writer here. I'm going to commend USA Today for leaving Tua off the list. Now, I think that Tua is eventually going to be good. But just because you have the Alabama uniform on doesn't mean you're coronated before the season even starts. Yes, he made the throw to Devontae Smith. Georgia fans are tired of hearing about that. But how about you do it for a season? I mean, to me, it's almost disrespectful to Jarrett Stidham. or disrespectful to Jake Fromm, two guys that did go through the rigors of a year in the SEC, to say that just on the basis of a brief window of football, all of a sudden Tua Tagovailoa is better than them, or better than other top quarterbacks in the country like Khalil Tate or Will Grier, any other guys you want to mention here. I guess USA Today, I think, comes closest to getting it right, taking a bit of a wait-and-see approach when it comes to Tua Tagovailoa. Something else I want to mention from the world of the internet and part of this off-season chatter when it comes to a college football. We also mentioned Sports Illustrated fearing that it might have gotten it wrong when it comes to Jake Fromm, who they had ranked at number 65 on their list of top 100 players in college football. Some other SEC names they are at least somewhat fearful may have been underrated, at least based on some early reader responses, according to some of the writers at Sports Illustrated. LSU linebacker Devin White, one of those guys. Jeffrey Simmons, the defensive lineman from Mississippi State, and the aforementioned Jarrett Stidham, the Auburn quarterback. All three players mentioned by Sports Illustrated as potentially underrated guys. Now, for me, the most underrated of those three is probably Jeffrey Simmons. I mean, quarterback's obviously the most important position. Stidham could have a big breakout year, but there's a sense in which we don't really know how to slot all those guys yet. So let's put Stidham to the side here and say that between Devin White and Jeffrey Simmons, to me, Simmons is the more underrated guy. I think that Simmons is one of those guys that if you had kind of an open draft of SEC players, I think Simmons would be drafted very high. I think he plays a premium position. I think it's very much, in demand here. And when it comes to Devin White, the LSU linebacker here, the problem I have with Devin White is some kind of want to put him in that same Roquan Smith category of, impactful, game-changing interior linebackers. Sometimes it's hard to truly, be a game-breaking difference-maker from that inside linebacker position. It's certainly not as easy as Roquan Smith made it look a year ago. And if you go back and look at the stats for Devin White, he's compiling a lot of tackles. But look at the solo tackles. Roquan Smith for Georgia in 2017 had nearly 100 tackles on his own. That gives you an idea of what Roquan's doing. He was just a missile on the field for Georgia that Devin White couldn't match for LSU. Now, maybe White makes me look like a fool in October for downgrading him right now, but for the moment, I completely balk on the notion that Devin White is in the Roquan Smith category in terms of truly elite, difference-making inside linebackers. I'm going to need to see more from Devin White before I can make that kind of statement about him. A couple other quick stories I want to get to here. Speaking of Jarrett Stidham, who we mentioned a moment ago, I think he's had some interesting quotes recently. I think that Gus Malzahn's had some interesting quotes recently. Some of this we addressed on Friday here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. The notion that this year Stidham's going to have more freedom with the offense to kind of change plays, the line of scrimmage, and do what he sees being done here. You go back to last November, Gus Malzahn said some of the same kind of stuff, that Stidham had more freedom a year ago than virtually any quarterback he's ever had. And apparently here in 2018, the thought is he'll get even more freedom than that, which to me only makes sense. I don't think you buy a sports car unless you want to drive it fast. And I think that Stidham, given the fact that he's a former 5-star prospect out of Texas, one of these hotshot quarterback guys, I think you let them be the quarterbacks they want to be, and you sort of live or die with that guy. I mean, after all, the wide receivers for Auburn are unproven. The running backs here are unproven. I mean, Stidham, if he's not the unquestioned leader of that offense, maybe this team's not going anywhere. I think that Gus Malzahn needs to trust Jarrett Stidham. I think he needs to trust Chip Lindsey's offensive coordinator in order for the Tigers to be at their best. And if Malzahn sort of tinkers and remains in control of that offense, that's only good news for Georgia when these two teams play in November. And then finally here, you heard Mike Johnson mention a moment ago, have some weird quotes from Jimbo Fisher, Dave Campbell's Texas Monthly, or it's actually Texas Football. It's a big college football preview magazine that comes out in the state of Texas every single year. In this magazine, Jimbo Fisher takes a little bit of a shot at Kevin Sumlin, talks about Sumlin's office at Texas A&M because it's got like sort of dark, sort of marble floors and kind of, I guess sort of a modern look. Fisher said it looked like a damn nightclub. And that's sort of a weird shot at Sumlin, but it also seems to be a guy in Jimbo Fisher who feels like he's got a little too much hat, not enough cattle right now, to use a Texas cliche. This is one of those guys that's sort of been talking about big expectations for such a long time that I think maybe he's tricked himself into thinking he's already accomplished some of those things. This is one of the reasons why Fisher's already a pretty unpopular coach with a lot of SEC fans, because he seems to think he already owns the place when he was just hired to the job. Eventually, I think he's pretty good for Texas A&M, but maybe he may want to slow down on the bluster and the bravado just a bit That's at least my advice, and we'll make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, we've reached the time in the show now where we want to do our Dog Day Q&A, and it's a chance for you to kind of weigh in on the subject matter and the topics we've been kicking around the program today. We like doing that this time of year. I started off the show today by talking about Andrew Thomas and the fact that, what he said on Twitter, to the extent that it matters at all, maybe a brief hint and a clue that he's sort of growing into the role of being a leader for UGA, kind of putting team goals, winning national championships ahead of personal ambitions like being a All-American here in 2018. And obviously Kirby Smart's challenged Andrew Thomas to be a leader. And I'm curious to find out from you, who do you think, Thomas, other names, who do you think will emerge as a big leader for Georgia this season? I'd love to have you weigh in on that. If you're listening to us on the radio or if you're listening to us on a podcast, you can obviously hit me up on Twitter at DawgNation Daily. If you're watching right now, you can also comment on our Facebook page or our YouTube feed. We'll take a lot of your comments here today as a part of our Dog Day Q&A. And if you've never watched the show before, I'd also invite you to check that out, and you can comment live during the show. We love the interaction we're able to have. I watch them a lot during the regular broadcast and then kind of get to them once our broadcast is over with. So check us out on video one day if you've never gotten a chance to. So we'll talk about some of the comments. Let me go in here to the YouTube comment section first. Dapper Dan, kind of going back to a recruiting topic from before, says, I keep thinking about the wide receivers for next year. If we add Demetrius Robertson to the rest of the group, it's going to be lights out. That's an exciting thing to think about. Dapper Dan also mentioning Tommy Bush. So that's Dapper Dan there in our comment section, feeling optimistic and hopeful about what the Georgia wide receiving room might look like if Demetrius Robertson, the Cal transfer, is added to the mix there. And that's certainly something kind of exciting to think about. Let's go to some more comments on our YouTube comment section here as we kind of weigh in on some of this. Joe Brummel mentioning the Auburn situation, his concern on the Auburn, and I guess his big question there is involving who's running the football for Auburn. And obviously, if you want to think about Jarrett Stidham developing into a big-time quarterback, he's going to need some help, whether it be Boobie Whitlow or Asa Martin, the incoming freshman, Cam Martin, a guy that's been on the roster. This is pretty clearly an Auburn running game that has a good bit of turnover, and they're going to be predicted to be in the top 10 by most of the teams and most of the publications here this offseason. But that is by far a given when it comes to that Auburn running game, and one of the reasons why I think a lot of Georgia fans are optimistic that they can get another win over Auburn when they come to Sanford Stadium later on in November. All right, we'll take more of your comments both here on Facebook and YouTube in just a moment here. And, of course, you're always welcome to weigh in on Twitter at DawgNation Daily. That's how you catch up with me there. Before we wrap up our regular broadcast, though, let me remind you that here on this program, each and every day at this time, just like our buddy Eddie wants us to do, we do our Gator Hater Countdown because we believe that a good Georgia fan's a Gator hater. First and foremost, we think it's supposed to be Georgia's biggest game, and we think this year, Dogs get another win. 122 days from right now in Jacksonville for the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. It's our Gator Hater Countdown right here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. I'll also remind you that we have finally reached June 27th. That's the stated date for the announcement for four-star safety legend Cavazos from IMG Academy, thought to be choosing between Georgia and Ohio State. We talked to Jeff Sintel about this yesterday. You can check out yesterday's show for Jeff's thoughts on that. We'll come back tomorrow and react to whatever Cavazos decides. We'll see you then. And for those of you with us on a video, we'll take some of your comments. And I got to ask you for a huge favor. And I don't mean to get tedious and be in the weeds here for a moment. But if you were watching SEC Country Live yesterday, you may have heard me say this. My Facebook comment section has gotten really weird. Have y'all noticed the same thing, or is this just my computer? I feel like, for lack of a better description, the comments are sort of out of order now. It's sort of hard to follow along with the discussion. So if you've noticed something different, tell me. If you haven't seen anything different, I'd love to hear from you on that. I want to take as many comments as I can from Facebook. But admittedly, after all these years of doing this, it's actually getting a little harder to kind of decide where these comments are here. And, and keeping up with everything that's going on and kind of keeping up with a lot of this kind of stuff. So you can kind of help me weigh in on that. Some comments about the leaders kind of coming in here. Jeffrey Rost is talking about DeAndre Swift. Raphael Wright says DeAndre Baker is going to be a leader here for Georgia. Kibo Weir says that Georgia needs a leader on defense. I would certainly agree on that. James Crump thinks that both quarterbacks, Fromm and Fields, have a chance to be leaders. I saw Tyler Clark here mentioned. So the comments coming in really fast here. Kind of interesting to kind of see them all. Richard Pollard says, I think that Elisha Holyfield's going to be a sleeper. He's really going to eat this year. I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about there. You see Natrez Patrick mentioned here. Ken Blankenship also sending kind of a breakout year for Natrez Patrick. I think that Patrick would be one of those guys, if he could become a leader, I think that would be a really sort of interesting scenario to think about. It would be in a lot of ways similar to what, Jonathan Ledbetter has sort of publicly overcome. Ledbetter sort of talked about some of his issues in the past. He's put them behind him. I think that gives him now an even better story to tell. I think Ledbetter, and when he's spoken to the media about this, has been pretty good at telling his own story here. And Natrez Patrick could be very much the same kind of way. Public loves redemption stories. I think Ledbetter is in the midst of a redemption story here at Georgia. I think that Kirby Smart's help in that regard has been commendable. And I think that Natrez Patrick could be on his way to the same kind of thing here. And I think that's a really kind of a cool thing to think about. Graham Jones says, I believe that Jake Fromm is going to put that offense together. He's the leader that we've needed for some time. Great game management and a really smart kid. And behind that offensive line, let me find the rest of this comment. I'm telling you, Facebook has gotten really hard for me to follow these comments on. Now I can't even find the comment anymore. I have no idea where it is. So I think that's interesting that Fromm may really put it together in a really special way here in 2018. That's kind of the point that I think that Mike Johnson was making a little earlier. That's also kind of the point that I sort of loosely referred to off the top of the show when we talked about Jake Fromm. That sometimes there's major growth that happens between year one and year two. Guys that do go into that second year of being a starting quarterback, you see them really take a dramatic leap towards being a truly great player. We saw some of Tim Tebow in his freshman season of 2006. By 2007, he was a force to be reckoned with. Obviously there's legitimate excitement about Justin Fields, and for good reason. But it could be that Fromm, because of the fact that a little bit of experience matters here, this is almost like one of those like computer code deals. There's a huge difference between 0 and 1. Right now, Justin Fields is at 0. Jake Fromm is at 1. It's a binary thing here. It's the difference between nothing and something. And the something that Fromm has, the experience that he does have, I think is a real valuable asset for him, and one that he might really put to good use in becoming a truly top-flight quarterback. Here's a Facebook comment that I can read from Miriam Martin Corbin, who says she hates those Gators every day in every way. I do love the idea about that. Scott McFadden asked about the Legend Cavazos decision, what times it's supposed to be. I think it's sometime in the afternoon. If you look at his Twitter feed, he actually put the time when he tweeted it. I forget what time it was, but it was sometime in the afternoon, I believe. Will Puckett says, upcoming leader on defense is DeAndre Walker. Had a phenomenal season last year, 5.5 sacks behind Lorenzo Carter and Davin Bellamy. The other thing about DeAndre Walker, when you want to look at his statistical profile, it wasn't just the sacks that he got. He had, definitely double-digit tackles for loss. What was he about? 13 or 14 tackles for loss? That's the other stat that sort of jumps off to you about DeAndre Walker. But here's the thing to remember. There's not always a correlation between best player on the field, highest statistical performance, and true leadership. I think you have to be a good player to be a leader, but that doesn't mean that the best player is going to be the best leader. I mean, with all due respect here, I think that it's only fair to point out that Nick Chubb, while he was always a great player at Georgia, probably did not become a great leader until his final year. He was just a quiet, soft-spoken guy. Now, when he came back because of unfinished business and when he spoke to the team about all that kind of stuff, when he went into Jim Chaney's offense to question the way that the running backs were being used, that was him finally growing into that role. But he had been a great player as a freshman, sophomore, junior, without really probably taking on that mantle of vocal leadership. So I don't know a ton about the personality of DeAndre Walker or DeAndre Baker, some of the names that are popular on this topic right now. I don't know their personalities as well. But just because you're a potential first-round pick, Baker is, and just because you had big stats a year ago and may have more of them this upcoming year, which DeAndre Walker might, certainly did a year ago, that's not necessarily a guarantee of leadership. Lamont Gilliard's an example of this. Gilliard, I think most people would say, is thought to be a really good leader for Georgia, but he's not one of those guys because he plays center. He doesn't show up on stat sheets, and he doesn't show up on you don't see a lot of Gilliard, jerseys. You don't see a lot of fans saying, hey, my favorite player is Lamont Gilliard. That goes to sort of the more high profile guys, but he is, I think, a legit leader for UGA. So sometimes there's a little bit of a different correlation between who's a true leader and who the best overall players are. Miriam Martin Corbin asks about the Cavazos decision, how it's going to be announced. I'm sure he'll probably announce it on Twitter. That seems to be the way that a lot of those guys choose to do that here this day. Let me go over to the YouTube comment section. It was a whole lot easier to read. Keith Fold says, I sound different when I'm speaking on the show after the regular broadcast is over. I guess that probably is true to a certain extent, although I'm not exactly sure why I start speaking differently. Jacob Mahaffey says about the Andrew Thomas stuff just goes to show you how good Sam Pittman really is. That is probably true. Alexander Rain says, the only problem I have with YouTube is that if you don't catch the show live, I have to deal with those out of sync video. Weird that only DawgNation videos do that. I didn't realize that. That's kind of interesting. I guess we'll have to look into that. And he says it's the SEC Country Live kind of is the same way, that when you don't watch it live, it doesn't sync up quite as well. That's interesting to think about. I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Stacey Goebel says McCole Hardman will be a leader for Georgia. That could be true. Hardman's certainly one of those guys that's going to get a chance to be out there a bunch. Dapper Dan says, I like the idea of McCole Hardman and I believe it's Kearis Jackson working together every day. Those two guys are natural leaders, will be huge behind the scenes and on the field. I mean, one of the things that Kearis, I believe, is already a leader on is the work that he's doing in the weight room. Did y'all notice him at G-Day, for those of you who were in the building there that day? Kearis Jackson is big. I mean, I don't know what big means for a guy that's probably going to play most of his career as a sort of a inside receiver for Georgia, but you don't see many slot receivers that look like him. I mean, he is rocked up. It's just a different looking wide receiver. You know, he is just thick, and that's going to be kind of a cool way to see how Georgia chooses to use that. I mean, if you missed him in the spring, look for him this summer. We'll try to take some pictures of him when we're out there at practice, and certainly you'll see him this fall from time to time. He is. If you haven't seen Kearis in high school, if you're not super familiar with his film, or even probably put on some pounds since high school, he's bigger than you think he is. He's a pretty big dude. DSGB27 says, I read that the freshmen are looking good. It's certainly a good it's a good looking crop of freshmen. Kirby's going to play them a lot. There's no doubt about that. And I think we'll see a lot of these guys make big names for themselves. Particularly those freshman outside linebackers. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a scenario in which Brenton Cox is not a major contributor for Georgia this season. I just think he is. And, Adam Anderson, maybe he needs to add a couple more pounds to kind of be in that discussion, but we saw somewhat lean Walter Grant a year ago, get on the field. The Notre Dame game comes to mind where he had some success. I just really see those freshman offensive linemen potentially being able to do something for Georgia. Bobby Weatherington on Facebook says he's excited about Kearis Jackson too. Someone says they're really rooting for Natrez Patrick. Yeah, and I apologize for not being able to read that. Yeah, here's Chris Branham who says, I'm really rooting for Natrez Patrick to overcome his past issues and become someone that younger players look up to. That'd be one of the feel-good stories of the year. I think that's well said, Chris. And I absolutely agree with you on that. Absolutely agree with you on that. J.C. Howell says trolls are undefeated. Sounds like we may have had one again on the Facebook side. Hope that wasn't the case. But as I've told you before, we're kind of a big show. We have sort of a big following. And if somebody has a chance to kind of come in here and rally all up, that's a temptation that some people aren't going to be able to avoid. But you can ignore them and make them go away usually. Plus, I mean, I think there's also something to be said for, welcoming people into the fold too, and maybe they'll behave themselves. Matt Rukavina says that I hope Terry Godwin continues to improve. Would like to see him handle the ball a little better. Godwin improving, I think, is one of those storylines to watch for Georgia this year. Georgia at its best means a pretty significant contribution from Terry Godwin. Jeff Hensley on Facebook also says, and I guess we'll wrap up with this, even the national champs are not the SEC champs. Obviously, making reference to the fact that Alabama has the national championship trophy. Georgia has the SEC championship trophy. And while no Georgia fan would keep the SEC if trading for the national championship was an option, being the reigning SEC champion, something that Alabama could not do for this past season, is something. And I think that Georgia's got some bragging rights there. And I think that when Georgia and Alabama almost, inevitably meet up in December for the SEC championship, I think if Alabama walks in there with too much of a strut based on what it did in sort of a desperate situation in overtime a year ago, I think a lot of Tide fans may leave that game disappointed. But we've obviously got a long time to talk about that between now and then. For now, though, let me get ready to say thank you to all of you for being here. Love to have you check us out on SEC Country Live at 3 p.m. Eastern Time this afternoon. I'm going to put a comment in the comment section today on SEC Country Live. So if you're normally a YouTube watcher, at least check Facebook a bit. I'm going to put a comment in the comment section, kind of what I can tell you about the future of that show for right now. I'll explain that to you in the comment section later on today. So join us at 3 p.m. We'll pin it at the top for you to make it easier for you to find, and I'll address that when I can this afternoon. So if you're a fan of that show, if you watch it from time to time, today might be a good day to check in, just so you can at least read what I can tell you about the future for right now. So we'll see you at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for that. If you missed a portion of our regular broadcast, the podcast will be up and running for you here in just a couple of moments, and it would be my pleasure to have you join us tomorrow live once again at 10 a.m. for another episode of DawgNation Daily Live, presented by Marco's Pizza. Y'all have a great day. I'll look forward to seeing you then.